Chapter 4 of Breaking the Outer Ring, Marine Landings in the Marshall Islands by John C. Chapin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Army Attack, Kwajalein. In accordance with the overall campaign plan for the seizure of the Marshall Islands, the Army's attack on Kwajalein Island at the south end of the atoll began in exact synchronization with the Marine assault in the north. The same softening up process was used on D-Day, 31 January, with a large force of warships and planes pouring on a blanket of high explosives. The Navy, for instance, fired 7,000 shells. Because of the location of the islets immediately surrounding its main objective, the 7th Infantry Division was able to follow a plan identical to the Marines, with the 17th Infantry Regiment clearing the way for placement of close-by supporting artillery. The 145th Field Artillery Battalion then proceeded to inundate the target with 28,000 rounds. Then, on D+1, the riflemen of the 32nd and 184th Infantry Regiments landed on Kwajalein Island itself. Because of previous joint rehearsals held in Hawaii, the Amtraks carried in the assault troops with smoothness and efficiency. In addition, Major General Charles H. Corlett, the division commander, had an assemblage of DUKWs, amphibious trucks always called ducks, available, and it proved valuable in ferrying priority supplies ashore to the fighting men. Once ashore, the assault units found widespread devastation from the pre-invasion bombing and shelling. Smashed seawalls, uprooted trees, demolished buildings, scarred pillboxes were everywhere. Dug in amidst all this debris, the Japanese fought resolutely. This kind of close combat usually forced the issue down to the individual level. An Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, who later interviewed the troops, gave this account of how they dealt with the deadly Japanese spider holes they encountered. The holes were everywhere. Each one had to be searched from close up. Every spot where a man might be hiding had to be stabbed out. So greatly was the beach littered with broken foliage that it was like looking through a haystack for a few poisoned needles. The fire which cut the men down came from the spider holes farther up the line. It was the kind of bitter going that made it necessary for the junior leaders to prod their men constantly. The leader of the 3rd Squad had been trying to get his men forward against the fire. Private First Class John Trieger got up, rushed forward about 10 yards, hit the dirt, fired a few shots with his bar, Browning automatic rifle, and crumpled with a bullet in his head. Somewhat farther along, a bayonet was seen sticking up through a patch of fronds. The Jap crouched within it hadn't room to draw in the whole length of the weapon. Private First Class Edward Fiske fired his bar at the hole. The dried fronds caught fire from the tracers. At that point, Fiske ran out of ammunition. Private First Class Julian Gutierrez then took up the fire from his M1 rifle. He stood directly above the hole and fired down into it. Then the hole exploded. The Jap inside had turned a grenade on himself. A man's shattered arm came flying out of the hole and hit Gutierrez on the shoulder, splattering blood all over his face and clothing. The arm bounced off and fell to the side. As Gutierrez looked at it, fascinated and horror-stricken, he saw another bayonet rising out of a patch of fronds just beyond the outstretched hand and still quivering fingers. He yelled to a man behind him. The man relayed a grenade, and Gutierrez pitched it with all his might into the patch of fronds. It erupted in a shower of palm leaves and blood and flesh. Gutierrez reeled over toward the lagoon to cleanse himself of the blood. Before he could reach the water, in sight of all the other men, he vomited all over the beach. Minutes passed before he could gather himself together again. As the 2 Army regiments began their 3rd day of combat, it was dirty and dangerous work. One Marine historical summary of the Marshall's operation told their story. Resistance during the day was continually stiffer as the enemy took advantage of every possible uncertainty of the terrain and concentrated the fire of such mortars and artillery as were left to them. Despite the havoc wrought by the bombardments, there was still much cover available and positions were concealed with great adroitness. Many of the concrete installations still stood in partial ruin even though they had received direct hits from heavy naval guns, and the fire from 75mm cannon had little effect on them. It was necessary to employ heavy demolition charges to break emplacements sufficiently for the employment of flamethrowers and grenades. In the utter turmoil, it was nearly impossible to maintain contact. Nothing was any longer recognizable. The situation was made doubly uncertain from the fact that fire might come from almost any direction at the flanks, frontally, or from the rear. The going was tough. Weird things can and do happen in such fighting. A Japanese officer charged a U.S. tank with just his bare saber. In the dusk one evening, Japanese riflemen tried to walk into the American lines carrying palm branches in front of their bodies so they would not be seen. A U.S. infantryman carrying a flamethrower approached a pillbox and out through its door bolted a Japanese officer in counterattack. He was squirting a fire extinguisher towards the flame gun. The liquid doused the American soldier as he let the flame go. The Japanese officer dropped dead at his feet, burned to a crisp. And so it went for 4 long days until the far tip of Kwajalein had been reached and the island was declared secured. The successful battle for both ends of Kwajalein Atoll had been concluded, and a series of conclusions were drawn from it. Japanese deaths reached a total of 8,122, some 27 times the number of Americans killed. The relatively small scale of U.S. casualties gave Admiral Chester W. Nimitz the ready forces he needed to push forward rapidly with plans for further action. First, one more atoll in the Marshalls, and then quickly on to the vital Mariana Islands, the linchpin of Japan's inner line of defense. Kwajalein would provide the air base from which the B-29 bombers would conduct their raids on the Marianas, and the Army's 7th Infantry Division and the 4th Marine Division would play key roles in those future operations. Tactically, there were a variety of innovations in the twin battles at Kwajalein, and these would continue to prove valuable in the future. There was the first use of Navy underwater demolition teams, the first use of DUKWs in combat, the first use of command ships with special communications equipment to control the battle, the first use of airplanes to control naval gunfire, and the first use of armored amphibian tractors, LVTAs. In addition, the 2 battles saw the debut of new units designed to facilitate crucial communications during combat. These were the Joint Assault Signal Companies. The official Marine history of the Marshalls campaign described their complex responsibilities. The primary mission of this unit was to coordinate all supporting fires available to a Marine division during an amphibious operation. In order to carry out this function, the company was divided into shore and beach party communications teams, air liaison parties, and shore fire control parties. During training, the various teams were attached to the regiments and battalions of the division. Thus, each assault battalion could become familiar with its shore and beach party, air liaison, and fire control teams. Another new element was the way rockets were used. This was a centuries-old technique of bombardment, but in the Marshalls, the 4th Marine Division was the first American division to use rockets mounted on jeeps, pickup trucks, and Navy gunboats in combat. One other Marine resource was unique, the use of Navajo Indian code talkers in battle. They proved a perfect foil for the Japanese ability in previous battles to understand Marine voice-to-voice communications and Morse code. To prevent this, a group of Navajo Indians had been recruited and trained in special code words they could use in combat. When they were talking in the Navajo's exotic language, no Japanese would ever decipher the message. At Roy Namur, their walkie-talkie portable radios carried the urgent instructions back and forth between ship and shore, as well as between higher echelons and subordinate units, and did it so quickly that previous delays of up to 12 hours, intercepting, transmitting, and deciphering messages, were eliminated. Finally, the 2 battles for Kwajalein Atoll proved incontestably the effectiveness of prolonged and massive pre-invasion naval gunfire and aerial bombing. The U.S. planes and warships had so thoroughly scoured not only the target islands, but also the other Japanese air bases in the Marshalls, that not a single Japanese plane was able to attack the American surface forces in the campaign. End of chapter 4.